Bene, buongiorno a tutti, grazie di essere qui a questa sessione organizzata dalla rivista Scienze Regionali al congresso annuale di Scienze Regionali. Prima di entrare nel vivo della sessione vorrei parlarvi un attimo, illustrarvi i progressi che ha fatto Scienze Regionali nel corso degli ultimi anni. La rivista immagino sia nota a tutti, ma ripercorrere insieme il percorso che ha fatto la rivista può essere utile per stimolare i contributi da parte di tutti voi. Scienze Regionali nasce nel 2002. Inizialmente il nostro editore era Franco Angeli, nel 2017 siamo passati al mulino. Entrambi gli editori hanno dato un contributo notevole allo sviluppo della rivista e noi li ringraziamo. Dal 2012 la rivista è indicizzata in Scopus. Purtroppo stiamo ancora aspettando l'indicizzazione in Web of Science. Abbiamo applicato più volte, l'ultima volta lo scorso anno, avevamo passato la valutazione formale. Purtroppo Clarivate ha cambiato i parametri, i criteri di valutazione e quindi, ahimè, il processo è ricominciato quest'estate. Quindi speriamo di concluderlo presto e ovviamente con successo. Giusto due numeri che si usano ormai nella valutazione delle riviste. Scienze Regionali ha un H-index di 13, secondo Scimago, e lo Scimago Journal Ranking Index è pari a 0,31. Vi spiegherò dopo il significato di questi numeri. Da quest'anno la rivista si avvale di una piattaforma elettronica per la sottomissione dei paper. Qui trovate l'indirizzo, è molto utile non solo a noi perché rende più efficiente e più fluido il lavoro della redazione, ma anche a voi autori perché potete tener traccia dello sviluppo del processo editoriale dei vostri articoli. Scienze Regionali è una rivista multidisciplinare e questa Cloud, Word Cloud, lo dimostra. Ci sono tutti i temi tipici, caratteristici delle scienze regionali. Non ce n'è uno prevalente, non siamo una rivista monotematica, ci occupiamo di tutti i fenomeni rilevanti, ovvero che hanno un impatto sullo spazio. Ospitiamo contributi metodologici, contributi teorici, contributi empirici. Come diceva Alessandra prima, l'importante è che abbiano rilevanza nello spazio, non che usino dati spaziali e basta. Citazioni sono importanti per una rivista, ma anche per gli autori. Abbiamo un percorso crescente, in costante crescita delle citazioni della rivista. Il primo anno che eravamo citati in Scopus avevamo ottenuto solo 5 citazioni, nel 2021 non è ancora finito, ne abbiamo avute 191, speriamo, quindi noi siamo fiduciosi che entro la fine dell'anno supereremo il numero delle citazioni dello scorso anno. Complessivamente in tutto il periodo la rivista ha ottenuto 1088 citazioni. Che cosa? Quali sono i contributi, diciamo, che vengono citati di più o qualche statistica? Il numero medio di citazione per articolo, ne abbiamo pubblicati tanti in 20 anni, è di circa 5 citazioni per articolo, in media. Ovviamente ci sono articoli più citati e articoli, ahimè, meno citati, ma la percentuale di articoli che non viene citata è in calo. Ancora forse rilevante, 25%, ma in calo. Quali sono i contributi più citati? Quelli che sono pubblicati in inglese, che ricevono in media 6 citazioni, e quelli pubblicati su special issue. Gli articoli singoli pubblicati nei numeri ordinari e in italiano ricevono, ahimè, un numero di citazioni inferiore. Come ho detto prima, per una rivista, il posizionamento di una rivista dipende dai due numeri che vi ho citato prima. Qui vi presento alcune statistiche che ci aiutano a posizionare la rivista ovviamente nel panorama italiano, non nel panorama internazionale, perché rispetto ad altre riviste internazionali siamo ancora piccoli e siamo anche ancora giovani, anche se ci avviciniamo al nostro 20° compleanno. Ho preso come indice quello che vi ho citato prima, lo Chicago Journal Rank Index, che serve per misurare quella che loro chiamano l'influenza scientifica di un giornale. Questo indice tiene conto non solo del numero delle citazioni che riceve un giornale, ma anche dall'importanza dei giornali che citano la rivista. Se noi guardiamo a come si posiziona la rivista nel panorama, ripeto, italiano, credo che i risultati che abbiamo ottenuto in questi 20 anni siano di tutto rispetto. Scienze Regionali è prima nell'ambito, nella categoria di studi urbani, secondo Scopus, è seconda nell'ambito della geografia della pianificazione dello sviluppo ed è terza nell'insieme delle riviste economiche, ovviamente italiane, dove l'economia viene considerata a tutto tondo, economia, econometria e diciamo finanza. Quindi non siamo diciamo messi malissimo, anzi siamo direi messi molto molto bene rispetto a riviste più storiche con una reputazione, un prestigio maggiore rispetto a Scienze Regionali perché hanno una vita molto più lunga. Chi sono le riviste che ci citano? Per un 10% le citazioni di Scienze Regionali sono in Scienze Regionali, ma solo il 10%. Le riviste che ci citano, le più importanti, perché l'elenco è veramente molto lungo, lo troviamo qui. A parte Sustainability, che è una rivista molto recente, open access, troviamo importanti riviste di Scienze Regionali, European Planning Studies, Land Use, Regional Studies, Papers in Regional Studies, ma anche Archivio di Studi Urbani, Research in Transport and Economics, Journal of Urban Technology, Cities, Regional Studies, Regional Science Policy and Practice, Journal Economic Geography, Grow and Change e così via. Quindi un piccolo messaggio che vi posso mandare: mandateci i vostri contributi originali, questi aiutano la rivista a crescere, ma credo che rappresentino anche per voi un'importante e un'interessante vetrina. Se poi i vostri contributi sono anche scritti in inglese, questo aiuta sicuramente voi ad essere conosciuti da un pubblico maggiore e la rivista a crescere sostanzialmente ancora di più. Mandateci anche proposte di special issue, la redazione della rivista le prenderà in considerazione. Siamo interessati, come avete visto prima, a tutti i potenziali temi relativi alle scienze regionali. Il congresso annuale di scienze regionali è per noi un importante momento in cui riusciamo a capire dove stanno andando le scienze regionali e dove si sposta la frontiera all'interno delle varie discipline che fanno parte delle scienze regionali. Mandateci i vostri contributi in italiano o in inglese, come volete voi, in inglese come ho detto prima è meglio, e noi saremo lietissimi di prenderli in considerazione. Arriviamo adesso all'argomento più importante di questa mattinata, la Lectio Magistralis di Scienze Regionali. Ormai è una tradizione, abbiamo portato al congresso annuale di Scienze Regionali tanti nostri colleghi europei e anche americani, ve ne ricordo alcuni: Frank Van Oort lo scorso anno, Marian Feldman, Ron Boschma, Michael Storpers, Martin Andersen e così via. Quest'anno è veramente per me un grandissimo piacere e un grandissimo onore avervi portato Lisa de Propris. Lisa, tutti noi la conosciamo sicuramente, è difficile presentarla, però lo devo fare, quindi ti chiedo scusa Lisa se non dirò tutto quello che devo dire sulla tua grande diciamo carriera. Lisa insegna sviluppo economico regionale presso l'Università di Birmingham e nel corso della sua carriera si è occupata di molti temi importanti per le scienze regionali. In particolare ha approfondito temi con un'importante ricaduta territoriale come l'industria 4.0, lo sviluppo tecnologico, i cluster o distretti di servizi, le creative industries, ma si è anche occupata di temi di politica industriale e di politica di coesione europea. Recentemente l'ISA ha coordinato e concluso un importante progetto sull'industria 4.0, il progetto Makers, finanziato dalla Commissione europea nell'ambito del progetto Horizon 2020, dove ha analizzato l'impatto dell'economia digitale sull'industria manifatturiera, sulle piccole e medie imprese e sulle catene del valore europee. Il ranking di pubblicazioni di l'ISA è veramente impressionante, ha pubblicato articoli su numerose e sulle più prestigiose riviste internazionali, ve ne cito solo alcune: Regional Studies, il Cambridge Journal of Economics, Research Policy, il Journal of Economic Geography, ma anche il Journal of Industrial and Business Economics. Inoltre è autrice di numerosi contributi in volumi ed è ovviamente membro del comitato editoriale di Scienze Regionali. Non è la prima volta che l'ISA è invitata a delle conferenze come keynote speaker e inoltre ha partecipato a molte audizioni in importanti meeting organizzati dalla Commissione europea e anche dall'OECD. Cito la sua ultima pubblicazione, scritta in collaborazione con David Bailey, Industry 4.0 and Regional Transformations, pubblicata da Routledge lo scorso anno, in open access, così tutti noi possiamo avere accesso a questo importante contributo. Questo libro ci introduce al tema di oggi, The Opportunities for Local Development of Transformative Technologies. Si tratta ovviamente di un tema di grande attualità. La trasformazione tecnologica in corso è ampia, variegata e trasversale a tutti i settori economici. Nessuno dubita che essa possa migliorare l'efficienza e la produttività delle imprese che adottano le tecnologie digitali. Tuttavia, è a mio parere ancora poco chiaro come i suoi benefici effetti si possano tradurre in un miglioramento della crescita e della produttività per l'intero sistema economico. E soprattutto non è ancora chiaro se e in che modo la trasformazione digitale può contribuire a ridurre i divari socio-economici che oggi ancora esistono. Sono sicura che l'ISA, grazie alla sua esperienza e competenze in materia, ci aiuterà a capire meglio il ruolo e il peso che la trasformazione digitale esercita nell'economia, le sue connessioni con l'economia reale e, come ho detto prima, i suoi potenziali impatti sui divari territoriali. Cedo dunque la parola a Lisa, sperando di poterla annoverare presto non solo tra i lettori di Scienze Regionali, ma anche tra i suoi autori. Ricordo a tutti, se volete fare delle domande, potete usare la chat. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Vorrei incominciare dicendo che sono molto onorata di questo invito, ringrazio gli organizzatori, Camilla e Roberta, per aver pensato a me per questa prestigiosa lecture, proprio con la capital L. Mi scuso se nonostante abbiate scelto quest'anno uno scholar italiano, preferisco parlare in inglese, quindi io spero mi perdonerete per questo faux pas, ma credo che il mio inglese maccheronico sia meglio del mio italiano sgrammaticato. Quindi così incomincio la presentazione subito. I'm gonna go for my sharing my PowerPoint. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And it was way too generous. What I want to do today in this presentation is really to give you a sense of some of the things that I've been working on, but also some of the things that we need to work on. I think some of the comments yesterday some colleagues made was that we really need, as regional scientists, as regional economists, to really look at the impact of technological change on places, on regions. So it's really a call to action to some extent. Sorry, I'm trying to move the slides. Okay, so I'm really sorry, I'm just trying to, that's it. So first of all, let me just say that some of the presentation, in particular at the beginning, will be in really broad brushes with general trends and big themes. Then there will be more detail in the second part of the presentation. And in fact, the title is very optimistic because I'm talking about opportunities, but in reality, I think some of the things I'm saying will open more questions than actually provide really big solutions and answers. The shock that I'm looking at is the fourth industrial revolution technology, the emergence of this new technological wave, and in particular, the impact that this will have on places and the transition that these places will have to make over the next literally decade or two. I will use the term place as a general term. This will embrace words, concepts like cluster, districts, regional innovation system, or milieu, ecosystem. These are just locations where there is a dense industrial identity, but also a very thick fabric of socioeconomic activities. Some of the things that I'll be telling you coming out from a book that just come out, as kindly Laura mentioned, a book called Industry 4.0 and Transformational Regional Transformations. At the same time, if you don't mind me, a little spot, we are just, Marco Bellandi and I are guest editing a special issue of Regional Studies, which will come out in October, which exactly touches on many of these themes with a very large number of colleagues who have really contributed with very interesting papers. Now, indulge me in trying to frame some of the things that we'll be talking about with what do we know as regional economists, as regional scientists. And I'll do this relatively quickly. What we certainly know is that places matter. Spatial dimension of economic activities matter. And at this point in time, we need to remember that, take all these things back to the place, because a lot of the conversations, a lot of the narrative is at the technology level. And it seems like people are a little bit behind or hidden or unspoken. So we need to remember that what we know that places matter. Places also means people, means identity, means traditions, and also means well-being and welfare. The concepts which have scaffolded our understanding of place have been around themes like specialization, the importance of accumulation, but also more recently we've been told, well, actually too much specialization is not too good. And so we have looked at how urbanization economies, Jacobian economies, and the fact that systems host a mix of activities more or less related is very important for their long-term survival. So the ability of places to react to shocks really depend on the mix of activity that they have. And also a new debate has emerged around the role of services. And in fact, although the attention was on manufacturing activities, services were always kind of marginal to those core manufacturing activities. On the other hand, we saw the debate really shift into a better understanding of services, and actually services started to be seen, and we're talking here at the end of the 1990s, even a bit earlier, started to be seen really the high value added component of value chains. And with this said, we're going to come to what I have decided to be, or I've thought of being, in my view, is the very first shock that we as regional economists have, in a sense, faced, or at least, in the last 3 decades. And globalization has been something that has really shaken the foundations of places. Although it's been dealt with within the international business literature, the story was really told by multinational firms and the role of multinational firms, and how these decisions impacted very much on places and regions. There was this decoupling, therefore, between services and manufacturing. We know all what happened then, but this decoupling has really caused a lot of problems. Yesterday, in one of the presentation we heard, like the decoupling of service and manufacture actually has slowed down productivity in advanced economies. So to some extent, we see that this decoupling having really had a very negative impact on localities, in particular in advanced economies like Italy, like Europe. And regional scientists have looked at this and recorded and studied important phenomena like deindustrialization, technical de-skilling, and really crude unemployment, the impact that worklessness had on places. And we now have started to look back at those years, and we start talking about those who were left behind by globalization, those who were in a sense unable to enjoy the benefits of globalization. Now, these are places that where firms, key firms relocated or delocated, and what they did, they of course impoverished the industrial base of the home economy. A second big shock was, in my view, the 2008 financial crisis. And again, this was a global crisis, had national responses, privatizing banks, quantitative easing. But at the end of the day, again, it really brought back the conversation to what is the implication for places. And although until then globalization was seen as being great, we see that a new narrative emerged around themes like deglobalization, and also stretched to protectionism and trade wars, as we saw between, for example, China and the US. Regional science really looked at this with a changed interest in the importance of industrialization. So if the kind of financial crisis really brought to light how severe was the deindustrialization of advanced economies, and therefore the inability to react to a shock like that one. And so a new literature emerged on reindustrialization, rebalancing, resilience, regional path dependency, and smart growth. So growth beyond, and again, an important objective of regional science, with the real objective of creating and retaining jobs, because of course jobs are the bread and butter of any social and economic system. And also we saw a literature on reshoring, on rebuilding manufacturing, with huge empathy from policymakers who already, of course, at that point were really interested in understanding how they could make regional economies better. So a global phenomenon really shed light on weaknesses, fundamental weaknesses in regional economies. And one could argue that this second shock brought a new wave of left behind. In a sense, it created a new wave or a new generation of places and people who struggled to come out of the situation positively. And in part, this was due to 10 years of austerity that followed the 2008 financial crisis. As we all know, Europe, but also the US a little bit less, but Europe and the UK, they went through a decade of economic contraction, which was then followed by a period of public low investment, budget cuts fundamentally, but also very low private investments. And in a sense, we saw a period where businesses were really waiting to see what was happening in terms of policymakers. And at the same time, policymaking was simply too focused on public finances. And in fact, that was, of course, a huge missed opportunity to really start trying investing in new technologies, but also it really, in a sense, punished some of those who already had been hit by the first shock, punished those localities which now, for example, were dependent on public sector jobs. And they found themselves again in very, very precarious situations. What we found is that when we look at regional disparities, certainly there is no convergence between 2010 and 2018 if we look at any European Union table. This brings me to one of the kind of keywords of this presentation. One of the books that I read this summer was the book by Harari called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And this book really makes many interesting points. But one of these interesting points is that liberal capitalism has pursued liberty and growth and prosperity. So if we look, for example, all the narrative around austerity was to really maintain, create the conditions for growth. But in reality, that was done by reducing public investment and preferring public finance to actually invest in localities and in people. So the narrative around liberty, growth and prosperity has, however, delivered welfare for the few rather than the many, with, of course, very well documented huge income inequalities across countries, within countries, and again, many places and people, he argues, becoming economically irrelevant. And I think to some extent, this is a terrible thought. And in fact, for me, it was really a kind of an eye-opening moment, because his point is that, you know, you can fight exploitation because you feel that at least you've got some worth. People are exploiting something that you can do, and you've got some bargaining power. But places and people who have become economically relevant have no bargaining power to really trying to gain a voice in this debate. And in fact, he goes off, of course, talking about Brexit, about Trumpism. The bottom line really is that the two shocks that have really characterized this millennia have been very much cause pockets of left behind. The question is there, of course, how far beyond they are, and how irrelevant are these places? Are they irrelevant or not? Now, the second half of the 2010s were actually characterized by a sense of hope. I think the austerity period was about to finish, and a huge literature came out on Industry 4.0. And there was a sense that things were actually moving in the right directions. A lot of publications from policymakers, from international organizations around Industry 4.0. Literally, I think by 2019, everybody was aware that something was happening, new technologies were coming in, and we were really all on the verge of a big change. And then, of course, the third shock came, which was the COVID pandemic. I've seen on the program at this conference a lot of very interesting presentation on the regional impact of the pandemic. And again, my fear is that when we go in depth into these studies, we'll find again really much heterogeneity in the way places reacted or were hit by the pandemic. But I want to focus having said all that, so this is where you're coming from. So imagine, in a sense, this is the background of the fourth big shock that is about to happen in reality. We're not really yet in the thick of it. The fourth big shock is the wave of new technologies that are coming in with the fourth industrial revolution. Some people talk about Industry 4.0. Some people, others talk about the fourth industrial revolution. There is a general agreement that these that you find on the slide are the main technologies that will change significantly and systemically our economies and society. And really the two blocks are climate change and technological change. These are the two big components of the transformation that the fourth industrial revolution will unfold. I will not talk about climate change in this presentation because in itself it's worth a presentation in itself. So we'll concentrate on technological change, which very much at the beginning was measured in terms of robots, where automation was so relevant, also because the initial publications on Industry 4.0 were looking in particular at the application of automation and robotics in factories, with all discussions about job losses, about light out factories, and so on. In reality, when we started the project Makers with colleagues in the University of Venice, Gianfranco Collò and Mario Volpe, and also Marco Belandi in Florence, we wanted to provide a different understanding of Industry 4.0. And in fact, we're talking here, when our work was really 2016, 17, and 18. And we really wanted to introduce a broader definition of Industry 4.0. And that's why we kind of came up with Industry 4.0 Plus. But what it does, it allows us to really expand the horizon of our understanding of the change. And the change is systemic. The change is a system change. We can only understand this technological revolution, like all the others, as a system change. And to do that, we need to draw on the literature on system change. So the literature on technological paradigms, going back to the work of Paris, and also of technological regimes, going back to the work of Nelson and Winter. And if I and borrowing the famous waves by Carlotta Perez, we see that we are exactly in this passage at the moment. We are in what we can call transition, but in reality it is more of a shock than a transition, because the transition will be very quick. And we see the end of a technological wave where technologies which have reached maturity are now unable to provide further productivity gains. So this might justify why productivity has been sluggish, significantly sluggish over the last 20 years. At the same time, we see new technologies coming in a very crude way, though. These are really radical innovation. These are very much innovations in their most enabling form, where they don't have yet clear markets. Applications are still to be developed. And at the bottom of this line, we are in this phase, really the very beginning of the curve. And what will happen the next decade is that we will be in this phase of exploration. And this is a very important phase, because this will be the phase where, in my view, and in all those looking at this, it will be a bit of a 0-1 scenario, sink or swim, because the transition is so fundamental, so basic, they can only really allow change. The change is fundamental because actually a lot of people are talking about a very much a new value creation model, which encompasses changing our energy sources, the way energy is produced and distributed, changing in the way we access demand, the way in which firms will shape and connect to markets, but also different forms of market, different forms of demand. And also for this, completely new business models. In particular, some people have been talking about the curve becoming from smiling, becoming sad. In a sense, this could completely reshape the distribution of value creation in the value chain. And again, there's a lot of work at the moment done on this, which is very experimental. But why is this phase very important? It's very important because if the system tries to build a new business model, one of the key things that it does, especially where we are at a phase where technologies are very new, where products are very experimental, where consumers are very risk takers. They like to play with these new toys, but really they don't know yet what's the purpose of them. Of course, what we see is that there is likely to be, and there is, we see a continuum between innovation, production, and consumption. And this is bringing a collocation of these different phases together. In particular, a closing between innovation and production. Now, if we look at more co-creation between suppliers and consumers, we also then look at shorter life cycles. Some technologies would also allow the production at the point of consumption. This will have huge implication for the value chain, whereby you don't really send your supplier a piece, but you just send a file. And then the other firm will just literally produce the component itself through, for example, 3D printing, which is an emerging technology, but with lots of potential, which still are vastly unexplored. Again, as I said, new demands and new markets, privatization, not just simply within the supply chain, but also privatization in consumption. We see that really as becoming increasingly popular. Again, changing completely the relationship between the firm and consumers. If we look at production models, we see that we kind of always had this kind of dichotomy between local and global. And at the same time, whether production was internalized or externalized. And in this matrix, the production models somehow moved around different boxes. We had different models were prevalent in different times, depending on technology and depending on demand. So Fordism was replaced, for example, by flexible specialization with cluster and districts. Then we saw the creation of multinational firms, where they, of course, created these global networks of production, and they somehow joined the local with the local, but also they allowed production to be organized externally. Now, I would say even this matrix is really up for change. I'm referring to a book, to the latest book by Baldwin, Globotics. He talks about a continuum, for example, between local and global. So what does it really mean for production model if we don't have anymore this dichotomy between local and global, but we have a continuum? We have the space has almost no boundaries. At the same time, what does it really mean to production organizations if we move beyond simply having internalized or externalized production, but having, for example, what some call distributed networks? And I use this term, borrowing it from the blockchain literature. And in all this big organizational change, system change, we have our little places, we have our regions, we have the garment cluster, we have the automotive cluster, and the challenge for us as regional economists and scientists, but also for these places, is to understand where they are with respect to their industrial identity, to the industrial makeup, but also to the new technologies that are emerging. I wanted to, so there are, of course, different industries, there are different technologies. At this point in time, technologies are very much enabling, so they can be applied in different industry. And this is why I, in a sense, try to simplify this by showing how a technology can actually intersect a different industry. It can be declined and implemented in different ways through applications and exploration. So the big issue is, what do places really can do when they react to this technological change? Well, evolution economic geography theories would suggest that places will do something that is very close to what they've done before. In particular, the whole literature on path dependencies is telling us that places will follow a path-dependent evolution. And what we see this already emerging in some recent evidence that has found that that innovation and adoption in technologies linked to the fourth industrial revolution are present in regions which already have some technological nearest. So they have technology which are very close to these ones. And this seems to suggest a persistent cleavage between high-performing and low-performing regions. I point your attention to publications that are coming out in the special issue I just mentioned that exactly find evidence of this cumulativeness, looking at pattern data. The only paper that really seems to find something that really grabbed my attention was the paper by Camilla and Roberto, where they looked and they found, of course, significant evidence of path dependence, but also these new islands of innovation. And in a sense, this is quite interesting, because one of the things that we need to understand is whether this fourth shock a chance for places who have been left behind to become relevant, or is the fourth industrial revolution just consolidating and really crystallizing the irrelevance of some places? Now, to really understand this in detail, we need to understand how do places transition from one technology to another. And really, it's up to us as regional economists to really make this step, because the debate now is very much about technology. And of course, technology will be declined in different industries, but these industries, we know, they are place-based. They are in particular places. So we need to understand really how places transition. And we found very helpful to look at the literature on technological transition. This literature, linked to the work of Gills, look at how technologies evolve over time. However, this technology is space blind. So what we did in a joint work with David Bailey, we actually took the model but added a spatial dimension to the MLP perspectives. Within this framework, we have that places, for example, they find themselves in existing technologies. They are in regimes of existing technologies. In the background, there are all sorts of new regulations, general trends, existential threats, for example, climate change. And this is what the MLP framework calls landscape. This is the landscape that is the backdrop for regimes. But then the really innovative element comes from the niches. These are local incubators of new technologies. Now, what we did is to try to give a place to these incubators. These could be businesses, could be universities, could be garage firms, new entrepreneurs. And what we did, we identified what we called 4 transformative paths, trying to really create a new language around beyond path dependency. And these 4 transformative paths are characterized by the presence or absence of capabilities, which enable them to attract or not these niches. We identify innovative capabilities, docking capabilities, and translational capabilities. As you can see, for example, the absence of any capability means that a regime is unable to latch on to a new niche. It might see this new technology emerging within the industry or outside the industry, but it's not able to understand whether that new technologies will transform its regime. On the other hand, we have, for example, looked at endogenous transformative parts. This is where places have not only internal capabilities to innovate, for example, universities, research organizations, or very dynamic, innovative firms, but also they are able to attract niches that are floating about. So they have some docking capabilities. They can attract and support these firms. Now, we use the example of electric cars in the paper. Actually, we use more than one example, but the one I took out is quite interesting because, of course, what we see is a typical example of a disruptive change, which, however, is taking place outside the historical industry. So Tesla did not start its production of cars in Detroit or in any traditional automotive cluster, but instead, it, as a niche, a big disruptor, it was attracted by Silicon Valley. Why? Well, because the concept of car that Tesla is putting forward is that, I'll spare you the details on the history, which you can read in the paper, is that Tesla is not an object that takes people from A to B, but Tesla is actually a computer and an energy source on wheel. In fact, in Elon Musk's head, Tesla was a cog in a bigger scheme of new energy production. And to some extent, this explains why he chose to locate in Silicon Valley. As we know, Silicon Valley has huge competencies in alternative energies, and of course, large and innovative competencies on digital technologies. So, in a sense, this is telling us that there are niches out there, but they were not picked up by incumbents, by, for instance, automotive clusters. I mean, the first Tesla came out in 2008, very much during the Dieselgate, where we saw actually European auto makers still kind of holding on to an old technology, hoping just to cheat the regulations. Another very interesting case that we describe in the paper is the one of watches and smartwatches. Again, we take a technology applied to an industry, the watch industry, but then we look at the place. The Swiss watch cluster has been completely shaken by the advent of the iWatch in particular. And in fact, the iWatch was just a consequence, because the beginning of all this was the invention of a smart device for well-being that could be worn on wrists, where you can basically measure how much, how many calories one burns, how many steps you've done, heartbeats, and so on and so forth. Now these are, the famous Fitbit. Now these well-being bracelets became really, really popular, and all of a sudden this idea was caught by Apple, which of course designed and designed the iWatch. Now the iWatch. Literally, what the Fitbit didn't do is, at that point, is telling the time. So what the iWatch does is doing a lot of things and also telling the time. What it does, it's got so many functionalities, from well-being to, you can read your emails, you can check the news, you can do all sorts of things. Now, this, as you can imagine, has shaken the watch, the traditional watch cluster in Switzerland. And we have evidence of really the iWatch eating into the market shares of the luxury watches produced in Switzerland. Why? Well, because the iWatch was marketed as a high-end product, therefore competing head-to-head with luxury products. The big challenge for the Swiss watch cluster was to maintain the authenticity of what they were producing, whilst adding functionality to the products.
Sorry, Lisa, 10 minutes.
Fantastic, thank you. What we see is that, I just want to put this at this point, because I thought what is interesting here is you have on the left-hand side, maybe some of you have seen this already. I think it's quite revealing. Easter morning in 1900, Fifth Avenue, and you can see literally the road being full of horse carriages. 13 years later, 13, same morning, literally one could not spot a single horse carriage. So when change happens, it happens very, very quickly. And I think that's why the transition that I was talking about before, it will be much quicker than we expect. And therefore, I think the actions have to be much more drastic. And this one was very, in a sense, I really like the presentation by Michael yesterday and Basso on the huge investment that the European Union is really putting forward to favor this transition within the EU. And of course, we see the same in the US, massive investments that are of course going towards this, because the change will be very fast. And to some extent, it will be quite decisive. And again, as regional economist, one would think, well, how are places going to change? You know, we saw that there are these possible transformative trajectories, but really in detail, who and what can support places to make this transition? And recently, currently rather, I'm doing some work with Dimitris Thorai, who's at the PIN in Prato, and Eduardo Baldoni at the GRC in Sevilla, and we're looking at the role of KIPs. KIPs are very interesting firms, as you know. They host competencies that firms most of the times don't have, and which therefore they have to outsource. So understanding whether KIPs are present in a territory might actually provide some information on what we call territorial servitization. In a work that I did with Dimitri, published a while ago, we looked how KIPs could actually signal a recoupling of high-value services with manufacturing activities, therefore enabling the manufacturing sector to become hybrid, to become servitized. We're doing this now, and I'll give you some very initial results. We're doing this on Italy, so we're looking at KIPs in Italy. In particular, we distinguish between technological KIPs and professional KIPs. We use location quotients, and we have data at the regional and at the local labor market level. As you can see, by distinguishing between P-KIPs and T-KIPs, this enables us to really see whether whether there is a change in the need of places to rely on these different types of knowledge-intensive business services. So I'm going to just show you some maps and then a couple of takeaways. The data is 2012 and 18, and you can see already these are all the KIPs together, that there is an increasing concentration of KIPs in the north and in the center. So there's more employment. KIPs are growing between these two years. And this is true both for T-KIPs in the top tables and P-KIPs in the bottom table. When we do this at the local labor market level, what we see is obviously a pattern that is mirroring the one before. What we see in the south and in the islands, really pockets of high concentration of technological KIPs and professional KIPs. And these concentrations are sustained over time, but actually are strengthened between 2012 and 2018. We also did a scatter plot looking at manufacturing and KIPs. And again, what we can see when we take the two of them together, we see a change in the line. So the line then from negative becomes positive. What it means is that a greater concentration of manufacturing seems to be moving in the direction of also a greater concentration of KIPs. So KIPs are moving towards manufacturing activities. This is particularly true for the PKIPs, but it's not true for the TKIPs. The slope of the line is slightly flatter, but still it hasn't really changed slope. That means that there is an increasing closing of TKIPs towards manufacturing locations, manufacturing system, but this is still in progress. This slide is in Italian, and I left it in Italian, which was quite convenient. As you can see, of course, KIPs are highly concentrated in urban areas, but we see a slight increase, but sustained increase of the presence of TKIPs, in particular here, in systems, a manufacturing system of large firms and small firms. So a couple of takeaways from this last work is that we've looked at KIPs, but we could be looking at any other actor that can play this important role. And we're looking here at digital technologies. This is really an invitation for works that trying to unpack what do regions, places need to do to make really this transition for the better and not for the worse. So really employment growth for all KIPs in all types of local labor markets. In particular, we saw urban areas have a greater concentration of KIPs, but over time, KIPs seem to be shifting from urban areas to manufacturing systems. And there is an evidence, of course, of an increasing presence of KIPs in manufacturing systems. So by and large, if we had to take that away, the Italian manufacturing production system seems to have a kind of growing, probably better than a growing concentration of KIPs and TKIPs. It's too early to say whether this will help them, but surely the presence of KIPs at this point in time cannot be by chance. It cannot be underestimated. So further work on this is definitely for us to be done. Now, some general conclusion to the whole presentation. So I'm really wrapping up the presentation here. I talked about many things, and I as I said at the very beginning, I'm not sure I did provide any major answers, but I think the answers require much more evidence. And we, as a regional economists and regional scientists, we're working towards gathering that evidence to then deliver credible answers. But what is for sure is that we are facing a technological disruption that leaves no time for really hesitation. It is very much a quick and it is quite a disruptive change. So places here really face a junction. In a sense, the adaptation it could be in the short term, but in reality, the change has to be the long-term solution. And if not change, there will be decline. The big issue here is to avoid irrelevance. And this word is, for me, very deep in terms of understanding, but also it is deeper now if we think about how the previous three shocks, if we also take COVID in, how the previous three shocks have created pockets of irrelevance already. And these left behind, I'm looking at the UK and I'm thinking, are they close enough to be fished out, to be dragged back into the core? And I do have doubts. I can see easily how some pockets of the left behind will be further left behind. And this, of course, is cause of great grievance, but also worry, not just simply for the economic impact, but also for the social impact. And also for the policy implication this will have if we see a period of bimodal political understanding, in a sense, and in particular of where policy are decided more and more for the few as against the many. This is why, in a sense, the call is for in anything that we do, and anything that I want to do, is to just explore evidence of opportunity. Places have to create opportunities. I think we as scholars have almost an obligation to do our work, to publish our papers, but also to inform policymakers that there are real, crucial decisions to be taken here. And this means exploring, experimenting, trial and error, trial and succeeding, but definitely places cannot expect a status quo, or they cannot expect to survive if they remain in the status quo. Indeed, one final point, really final point, is on policy. I didn't really say much about policy because in reality, again, it would be a completely different presentation itself, and I'm working with some colleagues on a paper on industrial policy. And what we see is that against the grains of some of what we as regional economists have been writing on in the last 3 decades, regional policy, cohesion policy, I personally think that the times of big change requires also big visions, but also require big investments. And I'm saying this because I don't think that climate change and technological change can be resolved at the local level or at the regional level. I think that national government have to step up and really provide leadership, in terms of vision, with policies, with money, but also they have to take on board the idea, the commitment of undertaking grand investments. A bit like the motorway network in the 60s. Now we're talking about really changing completely our energy system, changing completely our transport system, changing completely our consumption system, education. All these cannot really be resolved at the local level, but they can be applied at the local level depending on the locality, but very much the big trends have to be shaped at the national level. I mean, just to give you an example, Bologna might decide to really go electric and have every other lamppost has a little charging, it becomes a little charging station. So, people in Bologna are welcomed and they are really encouraged to have electric cars. But in reality, would you really have lots of people buying electric cars if you think that this availability of charging points is limited to Bologna? No, you won't. You need a system change to really create the kind of change that will also impact on society and ultimately on the environment. Thank you.